Good evening all and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight I have 10 deeply disturbing accounts from hunters who ventured into the Appalachian wilderness and encountered something that should have remained buried in those ancient hollows. These are not campfire tales passed down through generations. These are first-hand testimonies from men and women who went into those mountains seeking game and instead became prey to forces both human and otherworldly. From figures that stalk silently between the trees to discoveries that law enforcement is still investigating, these stories will remind you why the old-timers warn against walking those ridges alone after dark. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Appalachian deep woods, where civilization ends and terror begins. This happened during the last week of October 3 years ago. I had been planning this hunt for months, ever since I drew a permit for a section of national forest deep in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky. The area was remote, accessible only by a logging road that had not seen maintenance in at least a decade. I am talking about the kind of remote where your cell phone becomes nothing more than a glorified alarm clock, where the nearest town is 40 miles away, and where you can hike for hours without seeing another human soul. That isolation was exactly what I was looking for. I wanted to be alone with nature, to test myself against the wilderness the way my grandfather had taught me when I was a boy. Looking back now, I realize how dangerously naive that desire was. I arrived at the trailhead just after 4 in the morning on a Monday. The forecast had called for clear skies and temperatures in the low 40s, perfect conditions for bow hunting. I had scouted this particular ridge the previous spring and found promising signs of a mature buck population. Rubs on saplings the thickness of my forearm, scrapes in the dirt the size of dinner plates, and trails worn deep into the mountainside from years of repeated use. Everything pointed to this being a productive hunt. I shouldered my pack, checked my headlamp, and started the 2-mile hike to the spot where I had planned to set up my tree stand. The walk-in was peaceful. The forest was just beginning to wake up. I could hear the distant hooting of a barred owl and the rustle of small animals in the leaf litter. My breath came out in small clouds, and frost crunched beneath my boots. By the time I reached my chosen tree, a massive white oak situated on a saddle between 2 ridges, the sky was just beginning to lighten from black to deep purple. I had hung my climbing stand during that spring scouting trip, and I was relieved to find it exactly where I had left it, secured 20 feet up the trunk. I clipped my safety harness to the tree, climbed up in the darkness, and settled in to wait for shooting light. As dawn broke, the forest came alive around me. Squirrels chattered in the canopy above. A flock of turkeys moved through the hollow below, their soft clucks and purrs carrying clearly in the still morning air. A red fox trotted past, pausing briefly to sniff at the base of my tree before continuing on its way. It was exactly the kind of morning I had been dreaming about for months. But around 7:30, something changed. The forest suddenly went quiet. Not the gradual quieting that happens when a predator moves through, but an instant total silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I scanned the ridges around me, looking for whatever had spooked the wildlife, but I saw nothing. After about 10 minutes, the normal sounds gradually resumed, and I convinced myself it had been nothing. Maybe a hawk had flown overhead, maybe a coyote had passed, through downwind where I could not smell it. There were a dozen reasonable explanations. Around 9 in the morning, I climbed down from my stand to stretch my legs and relieve myself. That was when I saw them. Boot prints in the soft dirt around the base of my tree. Fresh prints that had not been there when I arrived in the darkness. I would have seen them with my headlamp. These prints were large, probably a size 12 or 13, and they circled my tree completely. Someone had walked around my stand while I was sitting in it. They had stood directly below me, looking up, and I had never heard a sound. My mouth went dry. I looked around, suddenly very aware of how alone I was. The logging road was 2 miles away. The nearest house was probably 15 miles. If someone wanted to hurt me out here, it would be days before anyone even knew I was missing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another hunter had come through early in the morning before shooting light and seen my stand. Maybe they had just been checking to see if anyone was hunting the area. But that did not explain the silence. Anyone walking through the leaf litter would have made noise. Deer make noise, and they are built for stealth. A human walking around in the dark would have sounded like a marching band. Yet I had heard nothing. I climbed back into my stand and tried to focus on hunting, but my attention kept drifting to the forest around me. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every movement in my peripheral vision made my heart race. Around 11, I saw it. A flash of orange moving through the trees about 200 yards away on the opposite ridge. Another hunter, I thought with relief, except the flash disappeared behind a large poplar tree and never came out the other side. I watched that tree for 5 solid minutes, never taking my eyes off it, and the orange never reappeared. It was as if whoever was wearing it had simply vanished, or they were standing behind the tree watching me through binoculars. The thought made my stomach turn. I unslung my bow and held it across my lap. An arrow knocked, but not drawn. It was not much of a defense, but it was all I had. Lunchtime came and I decided to climb down and eat the sandwich I had packed. My nerves were frayed, and I thought maybe some food would help me calm down. I descended the tree carefully, unhooked my safety harness, and turned around to grab my pack where I had left it at the base of the oak. That was when I saw it. Lying on top of my pack was a rabbit. Its throat had been cut, and its entrails had been pulled out and arranged in a neat pile beside its body. The blood was still bright red and steaming slightly in the cool October air. This had been done within the last few minutes. While I was 20 feet up in the air, someone had walked up to my tree, killed a rabbit, and placed it on my pack as a message. I did not touch it. I did not touch my pack. I hooked my harness back to the tree and climbed up as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my bow. From my elevated position, I scanned the forest in every direction. Nothing. No movement, no sound, no flash of orange or camouflage. Whoever was doing this was very good at staying hidden. Or there was more than one of them, and they were coordinating their movements to stay out of my sight. Either possibility terrified me. I pulled out my phone, knowing there was no service, but checking anyway. Nothing. I was on my own. I looked at my watch. It was 12:15 in the afternoon. I had at least 4 more hours of daylight, and no way was I staying up in this tree after dark. I made a decision. I was leaving. I did not care about the buck I had been dreaming about for months. I did not care about the money I had spent on the permit and the gear. I wanted to get back to my truck and get the hell out of these mountains. The problem was, I had to climb down to leave, and climbing down meant being on the ground, exposed and vulnerable. I waited in the stand for another 30 minutes, watching and listening. Finally, I worked up the courage to descend. I moved fast, practically falling the last few feet. I did not bother unhooking my climbing stand or gathering my pack. I left everything except my bow and started moving toward the logging road as quickly as I could without running. Running in the woods is a good way to break an ankle, and being injured out here would be a death sentence. I had made it maybe half a mile when I heard the whistling. A human whistle, the kind you use to call a dog, coming from somewhere behind me. I stopped and turned around, an arrow drawn and ready. The whistling stopped. I waited for a full minute, my arm trembling from holding the bow at full draw, but I saw nothing. I let the tension off the string and started walking again, faster now. The whistling started again, closer this time. I did not stop. I did not turn around. I just kept moving, my eyes locked on the trail ahead, willing my legs to move faster without losing control. The next 2 miles were the longest of my life. Several times I heard footsteps behind me, matching my pace. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, they slowed down. Twice I spun around with my bow drawn, shouting for whoever it was to show themselves. Both times, I was met with silence and empty forest. By the time I reached the logging road, I was covered in sweat despite the cold, and my heart was hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. My truck was parked another half-mile down the road. I could see it in the distance, and the sight of it nearly made me cry with relief. I was 50 yards away when I noticed something was wrong. The driver's side door was standing open. I knew I had locked it. I always lock it, even in the middle of nowhere. As I got closer, I could see that the door had been pried open. The frame was bent, and the lock mechanism was broken. My stomach dropped. I approached, carefully, bow still in hand. The inside of the truck had been ransacked. My glove box was open, papers scattered across the seats. My center console had been emptied. The back seat had been slashed open, foam and fabric spilling out onto the floor. But nothing was missing. My registration was still in the glove box. The $40 in cash I had left in the console was sitting right on top of the pile of papers. This was not a robbery. This was a message. Taped to my steering wheel was a Polaroid photograph. I did not know people still use those. The photo showed me sitting in my tree stand, taken from ground level. I was looking off to the side, completely unaware I was being photographed. On the white border at the bottom of the photo, someone had written in black marker, "You should have stayed home." My hand shook as I pulled the photo from the wheel. I looked around the empty logging road, half expecting to see someone standing there watching me, but I was alone. Or at least, I could not see anyone. I got in the truck and it started on the first try, thank God. I did not care about the broken door. I did not care about the slashed seat. I put it in gear and drove out of there as fast as the rutted logging road would allow, the door flapping open the whole way until I got to paved road and could pull over to tie it shut with a bungee cord I found in the bed. When I got back to town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. I showed them the photo and told them everything. The deputy who took my report listened patiently, wrote everything down, and then told me something that made my blood run cold. 2 years ago, another hunter had reported a similar experience in that same area. Someone stalking him, leaving dead animals, whistling. That hunter had been found 3 days after filing the report. His body was in his tree stand. He had been shot through the chest with his own bow. The case was still unsolved. The deputy strongly suggested I not return to that section of the national forest. I did not need to be told twice. About 6 months later, I read in the newspaper that 2 men had been arrested for targeting hunters in remote areas of eastern Kentucky and southern West Virginia. They would watch hunters go into the woods, then follow them to their stands. They would terrorize them, then rob them when they fled back to their vehicles. Sometimes they would let the hunters go. Sometimes they would not. The article said they had been linked to at least 4 murders over the course of 3 years. I like to think those were the men who stalked me that day, but I never followed up to confirm it. I did not want to know if they were still out there. I still hunt, but I do not hunt alone anymore. I do not hunt in places where I cannot get cell phone service, and I never, ever hunt in those Appalachian Mountains again, because out there, in that deep wilderness where civilization ends and the old rules no longer apply, I learned a lesson my grandfather never taught me. Sometimes the most dangerous predator in the forest is not the one you're tracking. Sometimes it is the one tracking you. My uncle disappeared 15 years ago during what should have been a routine deer hunting trip in the mountains of West Virginia. His name was Mason, and he was one of those men who seemed born for the wilderness. He could read tracks like other people read books, could predict weather patterns by the behavior of birds, and could navigate through dense forest without a compass or GPS. He was the person our entire family turned to when we needed guidance about anything outdoors, which is why his disappearance made absolutely no sense to anyone who knew him. It happened during the second week of November. peak rut season, when the big bucks are moving during daylight hours. Uncle Mason had gone into the backcountry with two friends, both experienced hunters he had known since high school. They had packed enough supplies for 5 days and hiked 8 miles into a remote section of the Monongahela National Forest where they had been hunting together every year for over 2 decades. They knew that land better than they knew their own neighborhoods. They had names for all the major landmarks: the Standing Stone, the Twin Oaks, the Burnt Ridge. These were places etched into their memory through years of repetition and shared experience. On the 3rd morning of the hunt, Uncle Mason left camp at dawn to check on a trail he had been monitoring. He had seen a massive buck 3 days earlier during scouting, a 12-pointer that would have been the trophy of a lifetime. His tree stand was positioned along a game trail between 2 ridges, about 400 yards from their base camp. It was a short walk, maybe 10 minutes through relatively open hardwood forest. He told his friends he would be back by lunch, and if he got his buck before then, he would fire 3 shots in quick succession as a signal. They would hear it easily. Sound carries incredibly well in those mountains, especially on cold November mornings. Lunch came and went. No shots were heard. By 2 in the afternoon, his friends began to worry. By 3, they went looking for him. They found his tree stand exactly where it should have been, his climbing stick still attached to the tree, his safety harness hanging from a branch. But Uncle Mason was gone. His bow was leaning against the base of the tree, an arrow still nocked. His backpack was sitting on the ground, his lunch untouched inside. It looked like he had climbed down for a bathroom break and simply walked away from everything. His friends searched until dark, calling his name, firing signal shots, blowing whistles. Nothing. The next morning, they hiked out and called for help. Within hours, search and rescue teams were combing the area. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters flew grid patterns overhead. Volunteers from surrounding counties showed up to help. Over the next week, more than 200 people searched those mountains. They found nothing. No tracks. No torn clothing. No signs of a struggle or an animal attack. It was as if Uncle Mason had evaporated into thin air between his tree stand and the camp. The official search was called off after 11 days. The family was told that sometimes people get disoriented in the wilderness, that maybe he fell and hit his head, that his body might be in a ravine or cave where searchers could not reach. But none of those explanations satisfied anyone who knew him. Uncle Mason did not get disoriented. He did not make careless mistakes. And 400 yards was nothing, barely out of sight of camp. Something else had happened, but nobody could figure out what. My father never stopped looking. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, he would return to those mountains and search. He would camp near where Uncle Mason vanished and spend days walking the ridges, looking for anything the official searches might have missed. He did this for 15 years. I went with him a few times when I was younger, but the older I got, the more uncomfortable those trips made me. There was something wrong about that place. The forest felt different there, heavier somehow, like the air itself was watching you. Last October, I decided to go back. I'm 32 now, old enough to appreciate what my father had been trying to do all those years, and I wanted to help him find closure. Maybe I wanted closure for myself too. Uncle Mason had taught me how to tie fishing flies and how to identify animal tracks. He had been a constant presence in my childhood, and then suddenly, he was gone, leaving nothing but questions and grief. We drove up on a Friday morning, my father and I, carrying camping gear and enough food for a long weekend. The trailhead had not changed much. The Forest Service parking area was still a rutted dirt lot, with a faded wooden sign that listed the regulations for that section of the National Forest. We started hiking around 9 in the morning, following the same trails Uncle Mason had walked 15 years earlier. It took us about 3 hours to reach the area where he had disappeared. We set up camp a quarter mile away, not wanting to sleep in the exact spot where his friends had camped that week. It felt disrespectful somehow, like we would be intruding on a grave. Saturday morning, I woke before dawn and decided to walk over to Uncle Mason's tree. I'd been there before, years ago, during one of the official searches, but I wanted to see it again as an adult. I wanted to stand where he had stood and try to understand what might have happened. The walk took about 20 minutes in the early morning darkness, my headlamp cutting a narrow beam through the trees. When I reached the old white oak where his stand had been positioned, I stopped and turned off my light, letting my eyes adjust to the pre-dawn darkness. That was when I saw it. Something was stuck in the bark of a tree about 30 yards away, reflecting the faint moonlight. I walked over and felt my heart stop. It was a knife. Uncle Mason's hunting knife. I would recognize it anywhere. The handle was made from elk antler, and he had carved his initials into the base. MB. Mason Blake. The knife was buried in the tree trunk up to the handle, wedged in so tightly that I had to work it back and forth for several minutes before I could pull it free. This made no sense. The search teams had covered every inch of this area. They had walked past this tree dozens, maybe hundreds of times. There was no way they could have missed a knife embedded in the bark at chest height. Yet here it was, the blade still sharp, the handle still solid. I turned it over in my hands, looking for some explanation. That was when I noticed the blood. Just a few spots on the blade, dark brown and old, but definitely blood. And there was something else. Something carved into the tree trunk where the knife had been buried. I turned my headlamp back on and leaned close. Carved into the bark, crude but readable, were two things: Uncle Mason's initials, MB, and a date, November 15th, the day after he disappeared. My hands started shaking. I pulled out my phone and took photographs of everything: the knife, the carving, the tree itself. Then I put the knife in my jacket pocket and walked as quickly as I could back to our camp. My father was awake when I got back, boiling water for coffee over a small camp stove. I showed him what I had found and watched all the color drain from his face. He held the knife like it was made of glass, turning it over and over, touching the initials he had watched his brother carve 30 years ago. Then he looked at me and asked the question I had been trying not to think about. If Uncle Mason carved those initials the day after he disappeared, did that mean he was alive longer than anyone thought? Did he wander injured through these mountains for hours or days while search teams looked for him? Or was something else going on, something we could not begin to understand? We broke camp and hiked out that afternoon. Neither of us wanted to spend another night in those mountains. On the drive home, my father called the sheriff's office and told them what we had found. They said they would send someone to investigate, but I could hear the skepticism in the deputy's voice. A knife that suddenly appears after 15 years in a location that was thoroughly searched. Initials carved the day after a disappearance. It sounded like a hoax or a delusion. But we had the knife, we had the photographs, and we had no reason to lie. 2 weeks later, a forensics lab confirmed that the blood on the blade was human, and the DNA matched my uncle. They also confirmed that the carving in the tree was at least 10 years old, possibly older, based on how the bark had grown around it. So the knife and the carving were real, but that only deepened the mystery. How had they gone unnoticed for so long? And what did the date mean? I have spent a lot of time thinking about it in the months since we found that knife. I've developed some theories, but none of them make complete sense. Maybe Uncle Mason did survive that first day. Maybe he was injured and disoriented, and he carved those initials as a marker before continuing to search for camp. Maybe he died later that day or the next, somewhere the search teams never reached, but that does not explain why the knife was buried in a tree at chest height. That took effort. That took deliberation. Someone had to stand there and work that blade into the hardwood until it was secure. That is not the action of a man dying from exposure or injury. Or maybe someone else carved those initials. Maybe whoever or whatever took Uncle Mason wanted to send a message. Wanted us to know that he had been alive, that he had been conscious and aware while whatever happened to him was happening. That thought keeps me awake some nights. The idea that my uncle spent his last hours terrified and alone, knowing he would never make it home, carving his initials into a tree as a final act of defiance or hope. My father has not gone back to those mountains since we found the knife. He says he has his answer now, even if it is not the answer he wanted. He says, at least we know Uncle Mason survived into the next day, that he fought to stay alive and tried to leave us a sign. I am not sure I agree. I think there are still too many questions, too many things that do not add up. But I respect his decision. He has earned his peace. As for me, I went back one more time this past spring. I wanted to see if there was anything else, any other signs we might have missed. I found nothing. The tree was exactly as we had left it, the carved initials slowly being consumed by new growth. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the trees, trying to feel some connection to the uncle I had lost so many years ago. I wanted to believe he was at peace, wherever he was. But standing in those mountains, surrounded by that heavy silence, I could not shake the feeling that something was still watching, still waiting. And I wondered if Uncle Mason ever really left those mountains at all, or if some part of him is still out there, walking those ridges in the darkness, carving his initials into trees as a warning to anyone who might follow. I need to tell you about what happened to me and 3 friends last spring while turkey hunting in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. We had planned this trip for months, pooling our money to lease access to a 2,000-acre tract of private land that bordered the Cherokee National Forest. The property had a reputation among local hunters as being productive but strange. The landowner had mentioned something about the history of the place when we signed the lease agreement, something about old family graves and local legends, but we honestly did not pay much attention. We were focused on the massive flock of turkeys that had been documented on trail cameras throughout the winter. We arrived on a Saturday evening in late April, set up camp near an old logging road, and spent the hours before dark scouting and listening for roosting birds. The forest was beautiful in that way Appalachian Mountains are in spring. Dogwoods were blooming white against the deep green of the emerging canopy. Mountain laurel was just beginning to show buds. The air smelled like rich earth and new growth. We heard turkeys gobbling from several different ridges, which meant we would have options in the morning. Everything seemed perfect. That night, around the campfire, the landowner stopped by to check on us and make sure we had everything we needed. He was an older man, probably in his 70s, with the kind of weathered face that comes from a lifetime spent outdoors. Before he left, he pointed toward a ridge to the north of our camp and told us we might want to avoid that area. He called it Screaming Ridge. When we asked why, he just shook his head and said some places in these mountains carry old pain, and it is best to leave them undisturbed. My friend Grace laughed it off, as local superstition meant to keep hunters away from the best spots. The landowner did not laugh. He just looked at her for a long moment, then wished us luck and drove away. We decided to hunt Screaming Ridge. Of course we did. We were young and confident and convinced that we knew better than some old-timer trying to spook us with ghost stories. The plan was simple. We would spread out along the ridge before dawn, set up about 100 yards apart, and call in any gobblers that responded. Grace would take the western end. I would set up in the middle. Our friends Tyler and James would take the eastern positions. We had radios to communicate, and we all had GPS units in case anyone got turned around. It should have been a textbook spring turkey hunt. We started hiking in at 4:30 in the morning, well before shooting light. The climb up to the ridge was steep, and by the time we reached our positions, we were all breathing hard and sweating despite the cool morning air. I found a good setup against a large oak tree with clear shooting lanes and good visibility. I could see maybe 40 yards in most directions before the forest became too thick. I arranged my decoys, loaded my shotgun, and settled in to wait for dawn. The first hint that something was wrong came just after 5 in the morning, when the forest should have been coming alive with birdsong. But there was nothing. No birds, no squirrels, no insects. Just silence, complete and total silence. I had hunted for over a decade and never experienced anything like it. Even in the dead of winter, you hear something. Wind in the trees, the creak of branches, the distant call of a crow. But Screaming Ridge was utterly quiet, as if every living thing had fled or was hiding. Then the screaming started. It began as a distant wail, almost like wind moving through a narrow gap in rocks. But it quickly became clear that this was something else. It was a woman's voice, high and agonized, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. My first thought was that someone was hurt, that maybe a hiker had fallen and was calling for help. I grabbed my radio to alert the others, but before I could key the mic, Grace's voice came through, shaking and uncertain. She asked if we heard it too. Tyler confirmed. Then James. We were all hearing the same thing. The scream moved. That is the only way I can describe it. One moment it seemed to be coming from the north. Then suddenly it was to the east. Then the south. It was moving impossibly fast, much faster than any person could run through that terrain. And it was getting closer. I could hear it approaching, that awful wailing growing louder with each passing second. I pressed myself against the oak tree, my shotgun gripped so tightly my knuckles were white. The sound passed maybe 20 yards in front of me, and I caught a glimpse of something white moving between the trees. A dress, I thought. Someone wearing a white dress. But the glimpse was so brief, I could not be sure. Then the temperature dropped. I do not mean it got a little cooler. I mean the temperature plummeted like someone had opened a freezer door. My breath came out in thick clouds and frost began forming on my shotgun barrel. This was late April in Tennessee. It should have been 50 degrees, but I was suddenly cold enough that my fingers were going numb. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by a smell so foul it made my eyes water. Rotting meat, sulfur, and something else I could not identify. Something sweet and sickly that made my stomach turn. My radio crackled. James's voice came through, barely a whisper. He said something was standing next to his tree. Something tall and thin and pale. He could see it in his peripheral vision, but every time he tried to look directly at it, his eyes would not focus. It was like looking at something through water, or heat shimmer. Tyler broke in, his voice panicked. He said he could hear breathing right behind him, feel hot breath on the back of his neck, but when he turned around, there was nothing there. Grace did not say anything. Her radio was silent. I tried calling her name. No response. I called again, louder this time, not caring if I spooked every turkey in the county. Still nothing. Tyler and James were both talking at once now, their voices overlapping, both saying they needed to get out of there, asking where Grace was, asking what we should do. I made the decision. I told them to forget about staying quiet, forget about the hunt, just get back to the logging road where we had split up. We would all meet there and figure out what to do about Grace. I stood up from my position, grabbed my decoys without bothering to collapse them properly, and started moving. That is when I saw her, the woman in the white dress. She was standing between two poplar trees about 30 yards away, facing me. Or at least, I think she was facing me. Her dress was long and old-fashioned, like something from the 1800s, stained yellow and brown with age and dirt. But I could not see her face. Where her face should have been was just darkness, a black void that seemed to absorb the light around it. And her neck was wrong. It was bent at an impossible angle, her head tilted almost 90 degrees to the side like it was broken. She moved toward me without walking. Her feet never touched the ground. She just glided, getting closer with each second. And as she approached, I could see that her jaw was hanging open, unhinged, like it had been broken or torn loose. That was where the screaming had come from. I could hear it building again, starting as a low moan and rising in pitch and volume. I did not wait to hear more. I ran. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping my face, roots trying to trip me with every step. Behind me, I could hear that scream following, and I could hear other things too. Footsteps that matched my pace. Whispers in a language I did not recognize. At one point, I swear I heard my name being called in my dead grandmother's voice, but I did not stop. I did not look back. I just ran as fast as my legs would carry me down that ridge toward the logging road. Tyler and James were already there when I arrived, both of them pale and shaking. We waited for Grace, calling her name, watching the ridge. She emerged from the tree line about 5 minutes later, walking slowly, her eyes unfocused. When we asked her what happened, why she had not responded to the radio, she just stared at us like she did not understand the question. She said her radio never made a sound. She said she had not heard any screaming, had not seen anything unusual, and did not understand why we were so upset. But her hands were shaking, and there were tears running down her face that she did not seem to notice. We packed up our camp in record time, throwing gear into trucks without any organization or care. The landowner's vehicle was parked near ours, and he was sitting on the tailgate like he had been waiting for us. He did not look surprised to see us leaving. He just nodded and asked if everyone made it out. When we said yes, he seemed genuinely relieved. Then he told us, the story. In 1847, a woman named Sarah Whitfield murdered her husband and 3 children on that ridge, beat them to death with an axe while they slept, then hanged herself from one of the oak trees. The locals found them 3 days later when she did not come to town for supplies. They buried the family in the church cemetery, but they left Sarah hanging for a week as a warning and an insult. By the time they cut her down, her neck had stretched and her jaw had come unhinged from the weight. They buried her on the ridge where she died, unmarked and unmourned. The landowner said every spring, usually in late April around the anniversary of the murders, hunters and hikers report the same things we experienced: the screaming, the cold, the figure in the white dress. We left our gear, $2,000 worth of decoys, calls, chairs, and equipment scattered across Screaming Ridge. None of us went back for it. None of us ever will. Because some places in these mountains are not meant for the living. Some places hold on to their darkness and will not let go. And if you are smart, you will respect that darkness and stay far away from it. We were not smart, but we were lucky, and that is the only reason I am alive to tell you this story. My older brother Henry was the kind of hunter who lived for November. He would talk about deer season starting in July, checking trail cameras every weekend, scouting new locations, testing his rifle at the range until he could put 3 shots through the same hole at 200 yards. For 12 straight years, he hunted the same stretch of mountains in southwestern Virginia, a remote section of national forest that required an 8-mile hike just to reach his favorite camping spot. He knew every ridge, every hollow, every game trail on that property. It was his place, his sanctuary, and he never came home without a story worth telling. The year he disappeared, everything started normally. It was the second week of November, and Henry had taken his usual vacation time from work to spend 5 days in the mountains. He left on a Monday morning, his truck loaded with camping gear, food for a week, and enough ammunition to hunt every day. He promised our mother he would be back Friday evening in time for dinner. He always kept his promises. He was that kind of person, reliable, responsible, careful, the kind of man who triple-checked everything and never took unnecessary risks. When Friday came and went without any word from Henry, our mother tried not to worry. Cell service was non-existent where he hunted, and he had been late before when the hunting was good or the weather turned bad. But when Saturday morning arrived and his truck still was not in the driveway, she called me. I drove to her house, and together we tried to convince ourselves that everything was fine. Maybe he had gotten a big buck and was taking his time processing the meat. Maybe he had run into other hunters and stayed an extra night to socialize. We made excuses for him because the alternative was too frightening to consider. By Saturday afternoon, we could not wait any longer. I called the ranger station and reported him overdue. They took down all the information, his vehicle description, the license plate number, the trailhead where he always parked. a description of his camping spot. They said they would send someone to check on him first thing Sunday morning. I did not sleep that night. I kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong in the mountains. A fall, a heart attack, a hunting accident. Henry was only 34 years old and in excellent health. But bad things happen to healthy people all the time. Sunday morning, 2 park rangers hiked into Henry's camping area. They found his campsite exactly where he always set it up, in a flat clearing near a spring about a quarter mile off the main trail. His tent was still standing. His sleeping bag was laid out inside, looking like he had just climbed out of it that morning. His cooler sat beside the fire ring, still half full of food that had not spoiled because the November temperatures were cold enough to keep everything fresh. His rifle, a Remington 700 that he had saved for 2 years to buy, was leaning against a tree, unloaded and clean. Everything looked normal, everything except for the fact that Henry was not there. The Rangers called for a full search and rescue operation. By Monday, there were 40 volunteers combing those mountains, and by Tuesday, the number had grown to over 100. Helicopters flew overhead with thermal imaging cameras. Search dogs followed scent trails that led nowhere. Volunteers walked grid patterns through dense laurel thickets and scrambled down steep ravines looking for any sign of my brother. I was part of that search, walking those mountains until my feet bled, calling his name until my voice gave out, praying to a God I was not sure I believed in anymore. We found nothing. No tracks leading away from camp. No torn clothing caught on branches. No blood, no signs of a struggle. No indication that an animal had attacked him. His hunting boots were sitting outside his tent, which meant he had either left camp in his hiking boots or in his socks. Neither option made sense. Henry would never walk through those mountains without proper footwear. He knew better. The search continued for 11 days before it was officially called off. The Rangers said they had covered every accessible area within a 10-mile radius of his camp. If he was out there, he was somewhere they could not reach, or he did not want to be found. Neither of those possibilities brought any comfort. Winter came and went. Spring arrived, and then summer. Our family existed in a horrible state of uncertainty. We could not grieve properly because we did not know for certain that Henry was dead. We could not move on because we had no answers, no closure, no body to bury. Our mother aged 10 years in those 6 months. I watched the light go out of her eyes, replaced by a hollow sadness that never fully went away. Then in late May, nearly 6 months after Henry disappeared, a group of backpackers found a body in a completely different section of the national forest, almost 40 miles from where Henry had been camping. The body was badly decomposed, but dental records confirmed what we already knew in our hearts. It was Henry. The medical examiner's report said he had been shot once in the chest from close range, probably within 10 feet. The bullet had passed through his heart. He would have died within seconds. The case was ruled a homicide, but there were no suspects, no witnesses, no evidence that pointed to anyone specific. 40 miles. That is what haunted me more than anything. How did he end up 40 miles from his camp? That is not a distance you accidentally wander while disoriented or injured. That is multiple days of hiking through extremely difficult terrain, crossing several major ridges and valleys. Even if he had been lost, even if he had been trying to find his way out, he would have hit a road or a trail or some sign of civilization long before he traveled that far. And he had been shot, which meant someone else was involved. Someone had killed my brother and either moved his body or forced him to walk to that remote location before pulling the trigger. The detective assigned to the case had several theories. Drug runners were common in those mountains, using the remote national forest land to grow marijuana or cook methamphetamine. Maybe Henry had stumbled onto an operation and been killed to protect the location. Or maybe it was poachers, people who hunt illegally and will do anything to avoid arrest, including murder. Or maybe it was just random violence, some disturbed person living off the grid who saw Henry as a threat or a target. The detective interviewed dozens of people, followed every lead, checked every tip that came in, but there was never enough evidence to make an arrest. The case went cold. I went back to those mountains one more time, about a year after we buried Henry. I hiked to his old camping spot, which had been left undisturbed since the rangers had processed it as a potential crime scene. His tent was gone, taken as evidence, but the fire ring was still there, and I could see the faint impression in the grass where his sleeping bag had been. I sat there for hours, trying to understand what had happened, trying to feel some connection to my brother, some sense that he was at peace, but all I felt was anger and confusion, and a deep, aching sadness that would not go away. I've spent a lot of time thinking about who might have killed Henry and why. The truth is, I'll probably never know. The mountains keep their secrets, and whatever happened to my brother in those woods died with him. But I have heard stories from other people who hunt in that area, stories that make me wonder if the official explanations are the whole truth. Stories about people who live deep in the national forest, off the grid and off the map, surviving on poached game and running from warrants or worse. Stories about hunters who went into the woods and came back different, quieter, scared in a way they could not quite explain. Stories about places in those mountains that feel wrong, where the trees grow in strange patterns and animals refuse to go. I spoke to an old man who had hunted that region for 50 years, and he told me something I have never forgotten. He said there are parts of the Appalachian Mountains where the old rules do not apply anymore, where the line between civilization and wilderness has become so thin that it barely exists. In those places, he said, anything can happen. People disappear, people die, and sometimes, if you are very unlucky, you find out why. I do not hunt anymore. I cannot bring myself to go back into those mountains, to feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, to hear the silence that fills the spaces between the trees. Every time I think about it, I see Henry's face the last time I saw him, smiling and excited about his trip, promising he would bring back enough venison to fill our mother's freezer. I see his empty campsite, his rifle leaning against that tree, his sleeping bag laid out like he would be back any minute. And I see him somewhere in those mountains, 40 miles from safety, facing whoever or whatever killed him, dying alone in the wilderness he loved. The detective told me that most murder cases get solved within the first 48 hours, or they never get solved at all. It has been 3 years now, and there have been no new developments, no new evidence, no arrests. Henry's case sits in a file cabinet somewhere, one more unsolved homicide in a long list of cases that will probably never be closed. But I have not given up hope. I still check the news for updates. I still call the detective every few months to ask if there has been any progress. And I still believe that someday, somehow, I will learn the truth about what happened to my brother in those mountains. But until that day comes, I live with the knowledge that some questions do not have answers. Some disappearances do not have explanations. And sometimes, the mountains take what they want, and they do not give it back. Henry went into those woods looking for a trophy buck and a few days of peace. Instead, he found something that killed him, something that has never been identified or caught or brought to justice. And that terrifies me more than any ghost story or legend ever could. Because ghosts and monsters are not real, but the people who killed my brother. They're out there somewhere, walking free, maybe even hunting in those same mountains right now. And that is a horror I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I need to tell you about what happened to me during a week-long hunting trip in the mountains of West Virginia 3 Novembers ago. I had planned this trip for months, saving up vacation time and scouting locations throughout the summer and early fall. I found what I thought was the perfect spot, a remote hollow deep in the Monongahela National Forest where trail cameras had shown consistent buck activity. The area was so far from any road that I had to pack in everything I would need for 7 days, including a ground blind that I planned to set up near a well-worn game trail, The hike in took most of the first day. By the time I reached my chosen location and set up camp, it was nearly dark. I spent that evening organizing my gear, filtering water from a nearby creek, and preparing for the week ahead. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of November. Wind moving through bare branches, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of deer moving through the leaf litter. Everything felt right. Everything felt normal. I had no idea what was waiting for me in that hollow. No sense of the nightmare that was about to unfold. I woke before dawn on the second day and made the short walk to where I had positioned my ground blind the previous afternoon. It was a pop-up style blind, just large enough for me to sit comfortably with my bow and a small pack. I had positioned it about 15 yards from a trail that showed heavy deer traffic, with shooting lanes cleared in multiple directions. The setup was perfect. I settled in just as the sky began to lighten, trying to control my breathing and stay as still as possible. The first morning was uneventful. I saw a few does moving through around 8, but no bucks. By noon, I returned to camp for lunch and a short rest, then went back to the blind for the evening hunt. Again, nothing but does, and a young spikebuck that was not worth taking. As darkness fell, I packed up my gear and started back toward camp. That was when I first noticed the feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first, just a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, an instinct that told me something was paying attention to me. I stopped and scanned the darkening forest but saw nothing unusual. I convinced myself it was just nerves, just the natural unease that comes from being alone in the wilderness. The second night, I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving around my tent. Not the random wandering of a deer or the scurrying of a raccoon, but deliberate footsteps circling my campsite. I lay in my sleeping bag, frozen, listening to whatever it was make a complete circuit around my tent before moving off into the darkness. I told myself it was probably just a curious black bear, even though the footsteps had sounded wrong. Too measured, too purposeful. Bears do not walk in perfect circles. But I did not want to consider the alternative, so I forced myself to go back to sleep. The third day followed the same pattern. Morning hunt, return to camp, evening hunt. But this time when I settled into my blind in the pre-dawn darkness, I felt that sensation of being watched immediately. It was stronger now, more insistent, and no matter how many times I scanned the forest around me, I could not locate the source. Around 7 a.m, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Breathing. Heavy, rhythmic breathing coming from somewhere behind my blind. I sat perfectly still, afraid to turn around, afraid to make any movement that might provoke whatever was out there. The breathing continued for maybe 2 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I did not see a single deer that morning. That night, the thing came back to my tent. This time, the footsteps were closer, and I could hear something else. A low sound almost like humming or chanting in a pitch that was too deep to be human. It circled my tent 3 times, then stopped directly outside the entrance. I could see the shadow of something tall and thin projected onto the tent wall by the moonlight. It stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, then moved away. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. By the 4th day, I was exhausted and seriously considering cutting the trip short, but I had come so far and invested so much into this hunt that I was not ready to give up. I made myself return to the blind for the morning sit, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up and get out of those mountains. I settled into position around 5:30 in the morning, and this time I only had to wait about 15 minutes before I heard it. The breathing was back, but now it was directly behind my blind, maybe 10 feet away. I could hear it clearly over the sound of my own hammering heart. Then something touched the back of the blind. I felt the fabric push in slightly, like something was pressing against it with a finger or a claw. I wanted to scream, wanted to burst out of the blind and run, but I was paralyzed with terror. The pressure moved along the back wall, then around to the side, as if whatever was out there was examining the blind, trying to understand what it was. When the pressure reached the front opening, I finally found my voice. I shouted, loud and aggressive, trying to scare away whatever was harassing me. The pressure stopped immediately, and I heard rapid footsteps moving away through the brush. I should have left then. I should have gone straight back to camp, packed my gear, and hiked out. But fear does strange things to your mind, and I had convinced myself that if I showed weakness, if I ran, whatever this thing was would pursue me. So I stayed in the blind. I stayed for the entire day, not moving, not eating, barely breathing. And as the sun set and darkness began to creep through the forest, I heard it coming back. This time there was no subtlety. The thing walked straight up to my blind and stopped directly. In front of the opening, I could see its silhouette through the mesh window, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. It stood there, swaying slightly, and then it made a sound that I can only describe as laughter. High-pitched and mocking, completely inhuman. My hand found my bow, and I drew an arrow from my quiver, knocking it with shaking hands. If this thing tried to come into the blind, I would shoot it. I would put an arrow through whatever this creature was and deal with the consequences later. But it did not try to enter. Instead, it began to circle the blind, moving with a strange gliding motion that made no sound in the leaf litter. Round and round it went, and as it moved, it started to whistle. A simple tune, almost childlike, but wrong in a way I cannot adequately explain. The notes were slightly off pitch, slightly too long, and they seemed to burrow into my mind and make my teeth ache. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sight of that thing circling me. But closing my eyes made it worse. Now all I could focus on was the sound of that whistling and the knowledge that something was out there, something that should not exist. I do not know how long it lasted. Time stopped having meaning, but eventually the whistling stopped. The footsteps stopped. The presence that had been pressing in on me from all sides suddenly lifted, and I was alone again. I waited until I could see the first light of dawn before I carefully opened the blind and looked outside. There was nothing there. No tracks. No sign that anything had been standing in front of my shelter. But when I looked at the ground behind my blind, I saw them. Footprints. Human-shaped, but wrong. The toes were too long, and there were only 4 of them instead of 5. And they were huge, easily 18 inches from heel to toe. I did not go back to camp. I left everything, the blind, my pack, my bow. I started walking toward the trailhead as fast as I could without running, and I did not stop until I reached my truck 8 miles away. My lungs were burning and my legs were shaking, but I kept moving. Because I knew if I stopped, if I looked back, I would see it following me. I could feel it out there, keeping pace with me through the trees, watching and waiting. When I finally reached my truck and locked myself inside, I broke down. I sat there in the driver's seat, shaking and crying like a child, unable to process what had just happened. I must have sat there for an hour before I had the composure to start the engine and drive away. I did not stop driving until I was out of West Virginia entirely, across the state line into Maryland, where I pulled into a gas station and called my hunting partner, Elijah. I told him everything. The circling footsteps, the breathing, the whistling, the impossibly tall figure outside my blind. I expected him to tell me I was crazy, that I had been alone too long and let my imagination run wild. But he did not. Instead, he got very quiet. Then he told me something that made my stomach drop. He said he had hunted that same area 2 years earlier. He said he lasted 3 nights before something drove him out. He said he heard whistling and saw a tall figure watching him from the tree line. He said he never told anyone because he thought people would think he was insane. A week later, Elijah went back to retrieve my gear. He said he found my blind exactly where I had left it, but it had been torn to shreds. The fabric was shredded, the frame was bent and broken, and my pack had been emptied, the contents scattered over a 50-yard radius. He also said he found tracks, dozens of them, all around the blind, all showing those 4 impossibly long toes. He took photographs, and when he showed them to a wildlife biologist friend, the biologist could not identify what species made them. They did not match any known animal in North America. I have not been hunting since that week. I still have all my gear, still have my bow and my hunting license, but I cannot bring myself to go back into the woods. Because I know now that there are things in those mountains that we do not understand, things that watch us when we think we are alone, things that follow us and circle us and whistle in the darkness. And the worst part is not knowing what it was. The worst part is knowing it is still out there, still walking those ridges and hollows, still watching for the next hunter who wanders too far from civilization, still waiting for someone else to set up a blind in its territory and spend a week learning that we are not the apex predators we think we are. Last spring, I decided to take my 7-year-old son on his first turkey hunt. His name is Lily, named after my grandmother, and he had been begging me for over a year to let him come along on one of my hunting trips. I was hesitant at first because turkey hunting requires patience and silence, 2 qualities that most 7-year-olds do not possess in abundance. But he promised me he would be quiet and still, and I figured it was time to start teaching him the skills that my father and grandfather had passed down to me. I wanted him to understand hunting as more than just killing. I wanted him to see it as a connection to the land, a way of providing for your family, and a lesson in respect for the natural world. We chose a spot I had scouted earlier in the season, a beautiful hollow in the North Carolina mountains, where a creek ran through a narrow valley, flanked by steep ridges covered in mountain laurel and rhododendron. The locals called it Dead Man's Creek, though when I asked about the name, nobody seemed to know the origin. Some said a Confederate soldier had died there during the Civil War. Others said it was named for a hermit who had lived in the hollow back in the 1800s and was found dead in his cabin one winter. Either way, the name did not bother me. Half the hollows in Appalachia have morbid names. It is just part of the culture. We arrived about an hour before sunrise, hiking in by headlamp along an old logging road that led down into the valley. Lily did remarkably well for his age, keeping up with me without complaint, his small camouflage jacket and pants making him look like a miniature version of myself. When we reached the creek, I found a good setup against a large hemlock tree with a clear view of a small meadow, where I had seen turkey sign during my scouting trips. Fresh scratchings in the leaves, droppings, and a dusting spot all indicated that birds were using this area regularly. I positioned Lily next to me, showed him how to sit still with his back against the tree, and explained in whispers what we would be doing. We would wait quietly until we heard a gobble. Then I would use my calls to try to bring a tom into range. He nodded seriously, his young face intent and focused. I was proud of him. For the first 20 minutes, everything went perfectly. We heard several distant gobbles as the birds left their roosts, and I made a few soft tree yelps to let them know there was a hen in the area. The sky gradually lightened from black to deep blue to that beautiful purple pink that comes right before sunrise. That was when Lily tugged on my sleeve and pointed toward the far end of the meadow, where the creek disappeared into a thick tangle of rhododendron. I looked but saw nothing, just the shadows of early morning and the dark tunnel where the creek flowed under the dense vegetation. I whispered to him to keep watching for turkeys, but he tugged my sleeve again, more insistently this time. He leaned close to my ear and whispered, "Dad, who are those kids?" I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. I looked again at the rhododendron thicket, scanning carefully, but I still saw nothing. No movement, no shapes that resembled children or anything else. I whispered back, "What kids, buddy? I do not see anyone." He pointed again, his small finger steady and certain. "Right there, by the bushes. There are 3 of them and they are waving at me." My mouth went dry, We were miles from the nearest house, deep in national forest land where nobody lived. There should not be any children out here, especially not at dawn. I kept my voice calm and asked him what the children looked like. He whispered back that they were wearing old clothes, like from a museum, and they did not have shoes on. He said they looked pale, really pale, like they were sick, and they were waving at him to come over to where they were standing. I made a decision right then. I did not care about the turkey hunt anymore. Something was very wrong about the situation, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get my son away from this place. I told Lily we were leaving, that we would come back another day. He started to protest, saying he wanted to go see the other kids, that they looked lonely, and maybe they were lost and needed help. I grabbed his hand firmly and said no. We were not going near those bushes. We were going back to the truck right now. He started to cry, which nearly broke my heart. He thought I was angry with him, thought he had done something wrong to ruin the hunt. I picked him up, something I rarely did anymore because he was getting too big, and carried him while grabbing our gear with my free hand. As we left the meadow and started up the logging road, I looked back one more time at that rhododendron thicket, and I swear to God, I saw them. 3 small figures standing in the shadows at the edge of the creek. They were too far away, and it was still too dark to make out details, but I could see their pale shapes, and I could see that they were watching us leave. I did not run, but I walked fast. Lily eventually stopped crying and wrapped his arms around my neck, and I could feel him trembling. I told him he had not done anything wrong, that he had been perfect, but that those children by the creek were not safe to approach. I did not know how to explain what I suspected, did not want to frighten him more than he already was, so I just said, sometimes in the mountains there are things that look like people but are not, and it is important to stay away from them. We reached the truck as the sun was fully rising, and I buckled Lily into his car seat, gave him a granola bar and some water, and tried to act like everything was normal. But my hands were shaking as I started the engine. On the drive home, Lily was quiet, staring out the window. About halfway back to town, he spoke up. He said the children had looked sad. He said they had been trying to tell him something, but he could not hear what they were saying. He said one of them, a little girl, had been pointing at the ground like she wanted him to look at something. When we got home, I kissed my wife and told her I needed to do some research. I spent the next several hours on my computer, searching through historical records and old newspaper archives. What I found made my blood run cold. In 1963, 3 children went missing while hiking with their family near that exact area. A brother and 2 sisters, ages 6, 8, and 9. They had been playing near a creek while their parents set up a picnic, and when the parents called them for lunch, the children were gone. A massive search was launched, involving hundreds of volunteers, search dogs, helicopters, everything available at the time. They searched for 3 weeks and found nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no sign of what had happened to them. The case was never solved. The descriptions I found in the old newspaper articles matched what Lily had told me. The children had been wearing clothes typical of the early 1960s. The oldest girl had been barefoot because she had taken off her shoes to wade in the creek, and the location where they disappeared was less than a quarter mile from where Lily and I had been hunting. The creek that ran through that hollow was Dead Man's Creek, the same creek where 3 children vanished 60 years ago. I called the local ranger station and spoke to an older ranger who had worked in that forest for over 30 years. When I told him the name of the hollow and asked if he knew anything about the missing children, he got very quiet. Then he asked me if I had seen something. I told him about Lily seeing the 3 children, about their pale appearance and old-fashioned clothing. The ranger sighed and said, I was not the first person to report seeing children in that area. Over the years, multiple hikers and hunters had claimed to see 3 kids near the creek, always in the early morning or late evening, always waving or pointing at the ground near the rhododendron thicket. He told me something else that made me decide I would never hunt that hollow again. About 10 years ago, a group of Boy Scouts had been camping near Dead Man's Creek. One of the scouts, a 12-year-old boy, had wandered away from camp in the early morning. The scoutmaster found him half an hour later, standing waist deep in the creek, completely soaked and shivering. When they asked him what he was doing, the boy said 3 children had told him to follow them into the water, that they wanted to show him where they were sleeping. He had walked into the creek and kept walking, even as the water got deeper, following the children downstream toward the rhododendron thicket. If the scoutmaster had not found him when he did, the boy would have drowned in a deep pool that lay just beyond where he was standing. I thanked the ranger and hung up. Then I went upstairs to check on Lily, who was playing with his toys in his room. I sat down next to him and asked him if he remembered what the children had been pointing at. He said they had been pointing at the ground near the bushes, at a spot where the leaves looked darker than everywhere else. I asked him what he thought they wanted him to see, and he shrugged. Then he looked at me with those wide, trusting eyes and asked if we could go back someday to help them. He said they had looked sad and lost, like they needed someone to find them. I told him no. I told him that some people who get lost in the mountains need to be left alone, that trying to help them can be dangerous. I do not know if he understood, but he nodded and went back to playing. I have not taken him hunting since then. My wife thinks I'm overprotective, thinks I am letting one strange experience ruin something that should be a bonding activity between father and son. Maybe she is right, but I cannot shake the image of those 3 pale figures standing in the shadows, waving at my boy, trying to lure him into the rhododendron thicket where 3 children disappeared 60 years ago. A few months after our experience, I read an article about a cold case team that was using new technology to search for the remains of missing persons. They had decided to focus on the 3 children who vanished near Dead Man's Creek in 1963. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they searched the area around the creek for 2 weeks. They found the children, all 3 of them, buried in a shallow grave hidden beneath a rhododendron thicket at the edge of the creek. The same thicket where my son saw them standing. The same spot they had been pointing at, trying to show him where they were sleeping. The remains were returned to the family, what was left of it. The parents had both passed away years ago, but there were cousins and nieces and nephews who gave those children a proper burial at last. I hope that brought them some peace. I hope they are not still standing by that creek in the early morning, waving at whoever passes by, trying to show people where they are. But I am not sure, because hollow places in these mountains hold on to their sadness. They remember what happened there, and sometimes that memory takes shape and walks the ridges long after everyone else has forgotten. And that is why we will never hunt Dead Man's Creek again. I set up 3 trail cameras on my family's property in eastern Kentucky last summer, trying to get a sense of deer movement patterns before the fall hunting season. We own about 80 acres of mixed hardwood forest that backs up against thousands of acres of national forest land, so wildlife is abundant. I had been hunting this property my entire life and thought I knew every ridge and hollow like the back of my hand. I was wrong. The cameras were nothing fancy, just basic models that take a photo whenever they detect motion. I positioned them along game trails and near mineral licks where I knew deer would pass regularly. The plan was to leave them out for 2 weeks, then collect the SD cards and review the images to see which bucks were in the area and when they were moving. Simple, routine, the kind of thing thousands of hunters do every summer across the country. I set the cameras on a Saturday in mid-July. The weather was typical for Appalachian summer, hot and humid, with afternoon thunderstorms that rolled through the mountains like clockwork. I marked the GPS coordinates of each camera location in my phone, took note of nearby landmarks, and hiked back out feeling good about my setup. 2 weeks later, I returned to collect the cards. The first 2 cameras were exactly where I had left them, undisturbed and full of the expected images. Deer, raccoons, a few coyotes, a black bear that made me glad I had secured the cameras properly. Normal stuff. The third camera was different. It was positioned on a ridge that overlooked a narrow hollow, a spot where I had consistently seen big bucks over the years. When I pulled the SD card and checked the image counter, my stomach dropped. Over 400 photos in 2 weeks. That was way more than I expected. The other cameras had only captured about 60 images each. 400 meant something was triggering this camera constantly, and I could not figure out what would cause that kind of activity in one specific location. I waited until I got home to review the images, popping the SD card into my laptop and opening the folder. The first 50 or so photos were normal. Deer passing through at dawn and dusk. A family of turkeys scratching in the leaves. More deer. Then around image 60, I noticed something in the background. Far back in the frame, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, there was a shape that did not look quite right. Too tall to be a deer, too thin to be a bear, standing perfectly still among the trees about 40 yards behind, where the deer were browsing. I zoomed in on the image, but the resolution was not good enough to make out details. It could have been a person, I thought. Maybe another hunter scouting the area, but something about the proportions seemed wrong. The figure appeared to be at least 7 feet tall, with limbs that were too long and a posture that was somehow off, like it was leaning at an angle that should have caused it to fall over. I told myself it was just a trick of shadows and early morning light, a combination of trees and underbrush that happened to look vaguely human-shaped. I moved to the next image. The figure was still there, same position, but the deer in the foreground had moved, meaning this was a different photo taken 30 seconds later. The tall shape had not moved at all. Over the next 20 images spanning about 10 minutes of real time, the figure remained in the exact same spot, while deer and other animals moved normally through the frame. Whatever it was standing completely motionless for an extended period. That is not normal behavior for any animal I know of. Even hunters who are trying to remain still will shift their weight, adjust their stance, make small movements. This thing was frozen like a statue. Then it started getting closer. Image by image, night after night, the figure appeared nearer to the camera. It was subtle at first, easy to miss if you were not paying attention. But when I started comparing images from different dates, the pattern was undeniable. On the first night it appeared, it was 40 yards away. 3 nights later, it was 30 yards away. A week into the deployment, it was maybe 20 yards from the camera, close enough that I could make out more details even through the grainy night vision images. It was definitely not human. The proportions were all wrong. The arms hung down past where the knees should have been. The head seemed too small for the body, or maybe the neck was too long. And there was something about the way it stood perfectly vertical, despite the slope of the ground, that violated every law of physics and biology I understood. But the worst part, the detail that made my hands shake as I scrolled through the images, was the eyes. In every single photograph where the figure was visible, its eyes were clearly visible as 2 bright white circles reflecting the camera's infrared flash. But they were not in the right place. They were set too far apart, and they seemed to be looking directly at the camera, not just in its general direction, but locked onto the lens with an intensity that came through even in a still image. The deer in these photos were behaving strangely too. In every image where the figure was present, any deer in the frame were facing away from the camera, their heads turned toward the tree line where the figure stood. They were not running or showing obvious signs of panic, but they were clearly aware of something in that direction. Their body language screamed alertness and unease. Several images showed deer frozen mid-step, one hoof raised, ears pointed toward the figure. The progression continued through the 2 weeks. By the final few days, the figure was standing maybe 10 feet from the camera, close enough that it filled most of the frame. I could see that it was impossibly thin, like something that should not be able to support its own weight. There was texture to the images. Now, enough detail to see that the surface of the thing was rough and irregular, almost bark-like. but it still maintained that vaguely humanoid shape, with a head and torso and those grotesquely long arms hanging down. The final image in the sequence was different from all the others. It was taken at 2:47 in the morning, and it showed the figure directly in front of the camera, so close that it was slightly out of focus. The entire frame was filled with its torso and head, and for the first time, I could see its face clearly, or rather, I could see where its face should have been. There was nothing there, no eyes, despite the fact that every previous image had shown those bright reflecting circles. No nose, no mouth, just a smooth expanse of that rough bark-like texture. The eyes I had been seeing were not eyes at all. They were something else, something that only showed up in infrared light. And now that the creature was too close to the camera, they had moved out of frame. I did not want to think about where they might have been positioned on the thing's body if they were not on its face. I checked the timestamps on all the images where the figure appeared. Every single one was taken between 2:47 and 3:15 in the morning, 28 minutes. No matter what night it was, the figure only appeared during that specific window of time, and it only appeared on nights when the moon was in a waning phase. The nights around the full moon showed normal activity. Deer, raccoons, the usual nocturnal animals going about their business. But as the moon grew dark, the figure appeared and moved closer night after night. There was one more camera, the one I had positioned about 200 yards away on the opposite side of the hollow. I had not checked those images yet. With a growing sense of dread, I loaded that SD card into my computer. This camera had taken about 200 images, roughly half as many as the camera that had captured the figure. I started scrolling through them, and my blood turned to ice. The figure was in these images too, but in these photos, it was not moving toward the camera. It was standing in one spot, and it was facing the exact direction of the other camera. Every single time it appeared, it was oriented toward the camera that had been documenting its approach, as if it knew the other camera was there, as if it was looking at it, or looking at whatever would eventually come to retrieve it. I called my hunting buddy Jackson immediately. "I know how this sounds," I started, "but I need you to look at something and tell me I am not losing my mind." I sent him the images. He called me back 10 minutes later. His voice was shaking. He asked me when I was planning to retrieve that camera from the ridge. I told him I had been thinking about going back out that afternoon. He said absolutely not. He said do not go anywhere near that ridge. He said he had hunted all over the Appalachians for 20 years and heard stories about things in the deep woods that watch hunters, that follow them and learn their patterns. He said people who go looking for those things do not always come back. I have not retrieved that camera. It is still out there on that ridge, probably still taking photos every night during that 28-minute window. I thought about calling the authorities, but what would I tell them? That my trail camera captured images of something I cannot identify. They would think I was pranking them or looking for attention. I thought about posting the images online, but I'm afraid of what might happen if the wrong people saw them. If word got out that something like this was in those mountains, every cryptid hunter and YouTube personality in the country would descend on my family's property. And I do not want to be responsible for what might happen to them if they go looking for that thing. So the camera stays where it is. I have written off that section of the property as off limits for hunting. I do not care if the biggest buck in Kentucky walks through that hollow every evening. I will never set foot on that ridge again, because I know now that there are things in these mountains that do not want to be found, but also do not want to be ignored. Things that watch us when we think we are alone. Things that move in the darkness between 2:47 and 3:15 in the morning. And the smartest thing I can do is leave them alone and hope they return the favor. I have been hunting the same 200-acre property in eastern Kentucky for 15 years. It has been in my family for 3 generations, passed down from my grandfather to my father, and eventually to me and my siblings. I know every ridge, every hollow, every game trail and water source on that land. Or at least I thought I did. What I discovered 3 years ago taught me that you can walk the same ground for decades and still miss what is hidden in plain sight, especially when someone does not want to be found. It happened during the first week of November. I'd shot a nice 8-point buck just before sunset, hit him clean through both lungs with my rifle. He ran maybe 60 yards before I heard him crash in the thick laurel that choked the bottom of the hollow. I waited 30 minutes before climbing down from my stand, standard practice to give a mortally wounded deer time to expire without being pursued. When I took up the blood trail, it was obvious and easy to follow. Bright red lung blood splattered on leaves and branches, leading straight down the slope into the densest part of the property. I had hunted this hollow before, but always stayed up on the ridges where visibility was better and movement easier. The bottom was choked with mountain laurel and rhododendron so thick you could barely push through it. But my buck was in there somewhere, and I was not about to leave him to waste. I followed the blood trail as it wound deeper into the tangle, using my headlamp to illuminate the splatter patterns in the growing darkness. After about 40 minutes of slow progress, I found where the buck had bedded down briefly before moving on. More blood, a lot of it, which told me he was close to the end. I pushed through another wall of laurel and suddenly found myself in a clearing I had never seen before. It was maybe 30 yards across, unnaturally circular, and in the center of it stood a small cabin. Not an old abandoned cabin like you sometimes find in these mountains, remnants of homesteads from a century ago. This was a maintained structure. The roof looked relatively new. Firewood was stacked neatly against one wall under a tarp. A path led from the cabin door toward what looked like a spring or creek, worn smooth from recent use, and there was smoke coming from the chimney. My first thought was that I had gotten turned around, that I had somehow crossed onto someone else's property without realizing it. But I had been on this land my entire life. I knew the boundaries. This clearing, this cabin was absolutely on my family's property. In a section I had walked past dozens of times without ever noticing it. How was that possible? The laurel grew so thick around this spot that it formed natural walls, and the only way in was the narrow gap I had pushed through while following my wounded buck. I stood there for a long moment trying to decide what to do. The cabin looked occupied. Someone was living here on land that did not belong to them. Squatters were not uncommon in remote Appalachian areas, people trying to live off the grid or hide from warrants or worse. But this seemed different. This seemed deliberate. The placement, the concealment, the fact that in 15 years I had never stumbled across this spot. Whoever built this cabin had chosen this location very carefully. I decided to come back in daylight with my father. We would figure out who was living here and deal with it appropriately. For now, I needed to find my buck. I circled the clearing, looking for where the blood trail continued, and found it on the far side. The deer had passed within 10 feet of the cabin before collapsing in another laurel thicket about 40 yards beyond. I dressed him quickly, dragged him back to the clearing because it was the only flat open ground available, and then hauled him out through the gap I had entered. It took me 2 hours to get that buck back to my truck, and I was exhausted and scratched to hell by the time I loaded him into the bed. The next morning, I told my father what I had found. He did not believe me at first. He had hunted that property even longer than I had, and he insisted there was no cabin in that hollow. But I marked the GPS coordinates on my phone, and after he checked a deer processing, we drove back to the property. We parked at the same spot and hiked in, following the path I had taken the night before. Only this time, in full daylight, I started noticing things I had missed. There were signs nailed to trees, crude hand-lettered warnings that said things like "turn back" and "private" and "no trespassing." Some of them had been there so long the bark was growing around the nails. How had I never seen these before? We kept walking and my father grew quiet. He saw the signs too, and his hand moved to rest on the pistol he carried whenever we were in the woods. A practical precaution in areas where you might encounter bears or aggressive feral dogs, but I knew he was thinking about the two-legged threats. We found the clearing easily enough in daylight. The cabin looked even more solid in the morning sun, built from rough-cut lumber that had weathered to gray but showed no signs of rot. The chimney was made from stacked stone, the kind of work that takes skill and time. This was not some temporary shelter. This was a permanent structure. My father walked around the perimeter while I stayed at the tree line, watching the door and windows for any sign of movement. He found more things that disturbed him. A large garden plot behind the cabin, recently harvested. A root cellar dug into the hillside. Animal bones arranged in patterns around the clearing, tied with twine and hanging from branches. Whether they were meant as decoration or warning or something else, we could not tell. Then my father called me over to something he had found at the edge of the clearing, hidden partially under leaves. It was an animal bone circle, about 3 feet in a diameter, with a deer skull in the center. Around the skull were arranged smaller bones, shells, feathers, and other objects in what looked like deliberate patterns. My father, who was not a superstitious man, backed away from it immediately. He said we needed to leave, that we needed to get off this land right now. But before we could move, we heard it. The sound of a rifle being chambered, the click of a round being loaded into a firing chamber. A man stepped out from behind the cabin. He was tall and thin, probably in his 50s, with a long beard and hair that fell past his shoulders. He was holding a lever-action rifle, not pointed at us, but held in a ready position across his chest. His voice was surprisingly calm when he spoke. He asked what we were doing on his property. My father explained that this was our land, that we owned these 200 acres and had the deed to prove it. The man smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. He said he had lived here for 8 years. He said he had asked permission from the mountain, and the mountain had said yes. He said that made it his more than ours. My father tried reasoning with him, explaining that we did not want trouble, but that he could not live here without permission. The man's expression changed. The smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and hard. He said we could leave and never come back to this hollow, or we could stay and see what happens to people who disturb his peace. Then he raised the rifle, still not quite pointing it at us, but the threat was clear. We left. We backed out of that clearing and hiked to our truck as quickly as we could without running. My father called the sheriff's office from the road. 2 deputies came out that afternoon with my father to investigate. They hiked into the hollow and found the clearing and the cabin. What they also found was a marijuana grow operation hidden in the laurel thickets beyond the cabin, hundreds of plants tended carefully and worth tens of thousands of dollars. They found a meth lab in the root cellar, still operational and dangerous. And they found weapons. Lots of weapons. Rifles, pistols, shotguns, many of them stolen based on the serial numbers. The man who lived there was gone. He had vanished into the mountains, taking only what he could carry. They never caught him. Over the next month, as deputies and federal agents processed the site, they learned more about the man who had lived there. His name was Chloe, and he was wanted in 3 states for assault, drug trafficking, and weapons charges. He had been living in that hidden cabin for at least 8 years, possibly longer, surviving by poaching deer and growing marijuana and cooking meth in a location so concealed that nobody had found him. The laurel had grown thick around the clearing over those years, creating natural walls that made the site nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look or happened to follow a wounded deer straight to it like I had. But the worst discovery came later. During the excavation of the root cellar, they found bones. Human bones. 3 sets of remains, buried in shallow graves beneath the dirt floor. They were old, degraded, difficult to identify. The medical examiner estimated they had been there for at least 5 years, possibly longer. DNA analysis eventually identified them as 3 hikers who had disappeared from a trail about 15 miles away over a span of 4 years. They had been shot, then buried under the cabin. The man called Chloe has never been found. Despite searches that covered thousands of acres, Despite alerts sent to every law enforcement agency in the region, despite rewards offered for information, he vanished completely. Some people think he died in the mountains, that he went too deep and got lost or injured. Others think he found another hidden spot and is living there still, watching and waiting. My father sold the property within a year. He could not stand the thought of owning land where such terrible things had happened. I do not hunt anymore. Every time I go into the woods, I think about that cabin hidden in the laurel, and I wonder how many other places like that exist in these mountains. How many other people are living in the hollows and ridges, watching hunters pass by without being seen, surviving in the margins between civilization and wilderness. The Appalachian Mountains are old, and they keep their secrets well. They hide things in their folds and valleys that most people will never find. And sometimes, when you stumble across those secrets by accident, you realize just how dangerous these mountains can be. Not because of the bears, or the weather, or the terrain, but because of the people who choose to disappear into them. People who do not want to be found and will do terrible things to ensure they remain hidden. That is the real horror of these mountains. Not ghosts or monsters or ancient curses, just people. And that is scarier than anything supernatural could ever be. I saved for 3 years to afford a guided elk hunt in the mountains of southwestern Virginia. Elk had been reintroduced to that region in the late 1990s, and by the time I booked my hunt, the population was thriving. Getting a permit through the lottery system was nearly impossible, so I went through an outfitter who had access to private land where elk were abundant. The cost was steep, almost $4,000 for a 3-day hunt, but this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I had hunted white-tailed deer my entire life, but elk were something special. The idea of calling in a 600-pound bull during the rut was a dream I had held since I was a teenager reading hunting magazines. I arrived at the outfitters camp on a Sunday evening in late September. The guide who would be taking me out was a local man in his 60s named Emily. She had been born and raised in these mountains, had guided hunters for over 30 years, and had a reputation for putting clients on trophy bulls. We spent that first evening going over the plan. We would leave camp at 4 in the morning, hike to a ridge where elk had been bugling consistently, and try to call in a bull during the prime morning hours. Emily seemed confident. She said the rut was in full swing, and the bulls were responding aggressively to calls. Everything looked perfect. That night, as we sat around the fire, Emily mentioned something that stuck with me. She said the mountains had been strange lately. Animals behaving oddly, unusual sounds in the night, a feeling in the air that she could not quite describe. When I asked her to elaborate, she waved it off and said it was probably nothing, just the kind of superstitious nonsense that mountain people sometimes believe. But I noticed she touched a small leather pouch hanging from her neck when she said it, and her eyes darted toward the dark tree line beyond the firelight. I should have paid more attention to that moment. I should have asked more questions, but I was too excited about the hunt to worry about vague warnings. We left camp the next morning in complete darkness, hiking by headlamp up a steep trail that wound through dense forest. The climb took almost 2 hours, and by the time we reached the ridge, I was sweating despite the cold September air. Emily found a spot she liked, a small saddle between 2 peaks with good visibility and natural cover. She set me up against a large oak tree, positioned herself about 20 yards to my left, and told me to get comfortable. Shooting light was still 30 minutes away. We would wait for the elk to start bugling from their bedding areas. Then Emily would call to them and hopefully bring a bull into range. The sky gradually lightened from black to gray. I could start to make out the shapes of trees and rocks around me. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional call of a crow in the distance. Then, just as the sun was about to break the horizon, we heard it. A bugle, high-pitched and piercing, echoing across the valley below us. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Emily smiled and nodded at me, then raised her bugle tube to her lips and answered. Her call was perfect, the sound of a cow elk announcing her presence to any interested bulls. We waited. Nothing. Emily bugled again, adding a few cow calls for good measure. Still nothing. Then we heard another bugle, but this one was different. It started normal, that high-pitched scream that elk make during the rut, but it went on too long. It kept climbing in pitch and volume until it no longer sounded like an elk at all. It sounded like a human screaming, or maybe something trying to sound human but not quite getting it right. The call ended abruptly, and Emily's face went pale. She turned to me and whispered that we needed to leave. Not walk away calmly, but leave immediately. She looked genuinely frightened, and that scared me more than the strange bugle had. Before I could respond, we heard it again, closer this time, maybe 200 yards away. That wrong bugle, that scream that pretended to be an elk, but clearly was not. Emily grabbed my arm and pulled me to my feet. She said we were going back to camp right now, but I was stubborn. I had paid $4,000 for this hunt. I had waited 3 years. I was not about to run away because of a weird sound that probably had some logical explanation. Maybe it was just an elk with a damaged larynx. Maybe it was two bulls fighting, and the sound was distorted by the terrain. I told Emily I wanted to stay, at least until we knew what was making that noise. She looked at me like I was insane. She said she had been guiding in these mountains for 30 years, and she had never heard anything like that. She said her grandmother had told her stories about things that live in the deep mountains, things that mimic animal sounds to lure hunters away from safety. She said the smart thing to do was leave before whatever was making that sound decided to get closer. But I insisted. I wanted my elk. Emily finally agreed to stay, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She touched that leather pouch around her neck again and mumbled something under her breath that I did not catch. 15 minutes passed in silence. The normal forest sounds had stopped. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just oppressive quiet that made my ears ring. Then the fog rolled in. It came fast, unnaturally fast, flowing up the ridge like water filling a basin. Within minutes, we were surrounded by thick gray mist that reduced visibility to maybe 20 yards. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath again. Emily was muttering now, louder than before, words I still could not understand. She was not talking to me. She was praying or chanting or something. That is when I saw it. Through the fog, moving between trees about 50 yards away, an elk. A massive bull elk with the biggest antlers I had ever seen. I counted the points quickly. 40. Maybe more. The antlers spread so wide they should have made it impossible for the animal to move through the forest, but it was gliding between trees without any apparent difficulty. The body was enormous, far larger than any elk should be, but the proportions were wrong. The neck was too long. The legs looked like they bent backwards at the knee, and when it turned its head to look in our direction, I saw its face. It had human teeth. I could see them clearly even through the fog, a mouth full of flat human teeth in a muzzle that should have had the grinding molars of a herbivore. The elk opened its mouth and made that sound again, that terrible bugle that climbed too high and lasted too long, and while it was making that sound, it looked directly at me. Not in my general direction, but directly into my eyes. It knew I was there. It knew exactly where I was sitting. And it smiled. I swear to God it smiled with those human teeth, lips pulling back in a grin that no animal should be capable of making. Emily screamed at me to run. She did not whisper it or suggest it. She screamed it, breaking every rule of hunting etiquette and safety. She was on her feet and moving before I could process what was happening, crashing down the trail we had hiked up just hours earlier. I looked back at the elk thing one more time and saw it step toward us. Not the casual walk of a grazing animal, but the deliberate step of a predator that has spotted prey. That broke whatever spell I was under. I ran. I have never moved that fast in my life. I fell twice, once hard enough that I thought I had broken my wrist. I lost my rifle somewhere in the first 100 yards, just dropped it, and kept running without looking back. Emily was ahead of me, moving with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for a woman in her 60s. Behind us, I could hear that thing following, not running, just walking steadily, its footsteps impossibly heavy for an animal that should have weighed 600 pounds at most. And it was still making that sound, that awful bugle scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We burst out of the tree line near camp and ran straight to Emily's truck. She fumbled with her keys, dropped them, picked them up, and finally got the door unlocked. We threw ourselves inside and she started the engine on the first try. As we pulled away down the dirt road that led out of the mountains, I looked back toward the trailhead. The fog had followed us. It was pouring out of the forest, flowing across the open ground toward Emily's camp buildings. And standing at the edge of the fog, partially obscured but definitely visible, was that thing. That elk that was not an elk. It was just standing there, watching us leave. Its two wide antlers framing that horrible grinning face. We drove for 20 minutes in complete silence before Emily finally spoke. She said what we saw was called a wrong thing in her family's stories, a spirit or demon or something worse that takes the shape of animals but never gets the details quite right. It lives in the deepest parts of the mountains where people rarely go, and it feeds on something in humans that Emily could not or would not explain. She said her grandmother had seen one 60 years ago, a bear that walked on its hind legs and had backwards feet. Her great-grandfather had seen one in the form of a massive snake with antlers. They appeared during times of change or stress in the mountains when the boundary between the natural and unnatural grows thin. Emily refunded my money, all of it, even though I had completed 1 day of a 3-day hunt. She said she could not, in good conscience, keep payment for a hunt that ended the way ours did. She also said she was done guiding in those mountains. She had been thinking about retirement anyway, and this was the sign she needed. She sold her outfitting business within a month and moved to North Carolina to live with her daughter. I tried calling her a few months later to see how she was doing and to ask if she had heard any more stories about the wrong thing. Her daughter answered and said Emily did not want to talk about what happened on that ridge. She said her mother had nightmares about it, that she still wore that leather pouch and had started attending church again after years of not going. I still have the photographs from that trip, pictures of the mountains at sunset, pictures of the camp, pictures of Emily and me smiling on the evening before the hunt. I look at them sometimes and try to convince myself that what I saw was not real, that it was a trick of the fog and my imagination, or maybe a deformed elk with some genetic abnormality that made it look wrong. But I know what I saw. I know what smiled at me through that fog with human teeth in an elk's face. And I know that Emily, who had spent 30 years guiding in those mountains without fear, ran like her life depended on it the moment she saw that thing. I never went back to Virginia. I never booked another elk hunt. And whenever I hear someone talking about hunting in remote Appalachian Mountains, I want to warn them. I want to tell them that there are things in those old forests that should not be disturbed. Things that were here long before we arrived and will be here long after we are gone. Things that know we do not belong in their domain and will remind us of that fact if we push too far into the wilderness. But I do not say anything, because who would believe me? Even I do not want to believe it. But every September when the elk start bugling and hunters start planning their trips, I remember that face, those human teeth, that smile, and I stay home. I inherited my grandfather's hunting cabin when he passed away 2 years ago. The property sat on 40 acres of isolated mountain land in western North Carolina, deep enough in the wilderness that you had to drive on a dirt logging road for 20 minutes just to reach the driveway. My grandfather had built the cabin himself back in 1962, hauling materials up the mountain in his old pickup truck and spending 2 summers completing the work. He hunted from that cabin every year until he was 86 years old and his health finally forced him to stop. When he died at 91, he left the property to me because I was the only grandchild who still hunted. I had visited the cabin a few times as a teenager, but those memories were vague and filtered through the haze of adolescence. Remembered it being dark and cold, with a wood stove that never seemed to produce enough heat and windows that rattled in their frames whenever the wind picked up. But it was mine now, and I figured I could fix it up, make it comfortable, and use it during hunting season. My wife and I drove up one Saturday in October to assess the condition and see what needed to be repaired before I could use it. The cabin was worse than I remembered. The roof sagged in places. The porch boards were rotted through in spots. The windows were clouded with grime, and one was cracked. Inside, everything smelled like mildew and mouse droppings, but the structure was sound, and I could see the potential beneath the decades of neglect. My wife, Abigail, was less optimistic. She walked through once, shivered, despite the fact that it was a warm October day, and said the place gave her a bad feeling. She could not explain what she meant by that, just that something about the cabin felt wrong. I dismissed her concerns. Old cabins always feel creepy when they have been abandoned for a while. A good cleaning and some fresh air would fix that. We spent the day hauling out trash and debris. My grandfather had been a pack rat, and the cabin was full of old hunting magazines, broken equipment, moth-eaten clothing, and things that should have been thrown away decades ago. In the corner of the main room, beneath a pile of old blankets, I found a wooden trunk that I did not remember seeing before. It was locked with a rusted padlock that broke easily when I hit it with a hammer. Inside were journals, dozens of them, all in my grandfather's handwriting, dating back to the early 1960s. I opened the most recent one and started reading. The entries were dated but not formatted like a traditional diary. They were observations, notes about deer movement, weather patterns, and successful hunts. Normal stuff for a hunter to record. But as I flipped through the pages, I noticed something strange. Starting around 2008, the entries changed. My grandfather began writing about things that did not make sense. Strange sounds in the night, footsteps circling, the cabin, shadows that moved against the wind. He wrote about feeling watched constantly, about finding objects in the cabin that had been moved while he was out hunting, about waking up in the middle of the night to find the door standing open even though he knew he had locked it. The entries became increasingly disturbed. My grandfather wrote about seeing things in the woods that should not exist, figures that were too tall and too thin, animals that watched him with intelligence in their eyes, trees that seemed to move when he was not looking directly at them. He wrote about hearing his dead wife's voice calling to him from the forest, even though she had passed away 15 years before he started documenting these experiences. And he wrote about the root cellar, how he never went down there anymore because something was wrong with it, how sometimes he could hear scraping sounds coming from beneath the floorboards in the middle of the night. I showed the journals to Abigail. She read a few entries and then set them down. She said we needed to leave. She said my grandfather had clearly been experiencing some form of dementia or mental illness in his final years, and the cabin had negative associations because of it. She did not want to spend another minute in that place. I agreed to leave, but I took the journals with me. I wanted to read them all to understand what my grandfather had been thinking during those last hunting trips. Over the next week, I read through every journal, starting from the beginning. The early entries were completely normal. Detailed accounts of successful hunts, observations about the wildlife in the area, notes about improvements he wanted to make to the cabin. But then, in November of 2008, the tone shifted. My grandfather wrote about finding animal bones arranged in a circle behind the cabin. He assumed it was kids playing pranks, even though the nearest town was 30 miles away. 2 weeks later, he wrote about waking up to find muddy handprints on the outside of the window next to his bed, prints that were far too large to be human. He convinced himself it was a bear, even though the prints clearly showed 5 fingers. The incidents escalated. My grandfather documented them all with scientific precision, as if recording the observations would somehow make them less frightening. Things went missing from the cabin and turned up in strange places. His rifle, which he always kept by the door, was found in the root cellar, even though he insisted he had not put it there. Food disappeared from sealed containers. His hunting knife, which he wore on his belt, vanished while he was sleeping and was found buried in the dirt floor of the cellar the next morning. Then came the entry that made my blood run cold. It was dated November 15th, 2012. My grandfather wrote that he had finally worked up the courage to investigate the root cellar properly. He had been hearing sounds coming from down there for years, but had been too afraid to look. That morning, he went down with a flashlight and a shovel, determined to figure out what was making the noise. What he found were bones, human bones, buried in a shallow grave beneath the dirt floor, partially exposed as if something had been digging them up. My grandfather wrote that he recognized the clothing fragments still clinging to the remains. They were from the 1970s, based on the style. He described sitting down on the cellar steps and crying because he suddenly remembered something he had suppressed for decades. In 1973, a family had gone missing while camping in the national forest that bordered his property. A father, mother, and teenage daughter. They were never found. The case went cold, and eventually people stopped looking. My grandfather had been hunting on his property that November, and he had heard screams coming from somewhere nearby, but he had convinced himself it was elk or foxes or some other animal. He had not investigated. He had not called the police. And now, 39 years later, he had found remains on his property and realized that what he had heard that night was not animals. The journal entry ended with a confession. My grandfather wrote that he believed he knew who had killed that family. There was a hunting party that used to camp on the national forest land near his property every year. 5 men who were loud and aggressive and made him uncomfortable whenever he encountered them. That same year, the family disappeared. The hunting party stopped coming. My grandfather had always wondered why, but he never asked questions. Now he understood. Those men had killed that family, buried them on his property to hide the evidence, and never came back because they knew what they had done. But here is where the journal gets truly disturbing. My grandfather wrote that he did not call the police. He did not report what he had found. Instead, he reburied the remains, covered them with fresh dirt, and tried to forget about them. He wrote that the guilt was consuming him, that he could not sleep anymore, that every sound in the night was the spirits of that family demanding justice. But he could not bring himself to come forward because it would mean admitting that he had heard the screams and done nothing. It would mean admitting that he had known about the bodies for years and concealed evidence. He was 84 years old when he wrote that entry, and he was more afraid of going to prison than he was of living with the guilt. The final journal entry was dated just 3 months before my grandfather died. He wrote that he could not go back to the cabin anymore. The hauntings had become too intense. Objects flew off shelves. The door opened and closed on its own. He heard footsteps every night, circling the cabin, getting closer, and he saw them. The family, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching the cabin. The mother with her head at a wrong angle, the father with his chest caved in, the daughter with her throat cut. They never came closer, but they were always there, watching and waiting. My grandfather wrote that he knew what they wanted. They wanted him to tell the truth, but he was too much of a coward to do it. I called the local sheriff's office the day after I finished reading the journals. I told them everything. They sent investigators to the cabin, and they excavated the root cellar. They found exactly what my grandfather had described. 3 sets of remains buried in shallow graves, with clothing and personal effects that matched the description of the family that had disappeared in 1973. DNA analysis confirmed their identities. The case was reopened as a homicide investigation. 2 of the men from that hunting party are still alive. Both are in their 80s now, living in different states. The investigation is ongoing, and I do not know if there will ever be enough evidence to prosecute them. But at least the family has been found. At least they can be buried properly, with their names on the graves and people who remember them. I sold the cabin and the land 6 months ago. I could not keep it, knowing what had happened there, knowing that my grandfather had let those people remain buried and forgotten for 4 decades to protect his own reputation. The buyer was a developer who plans to tear down the cabin and build vacation rentals. I hope whoever stays there never learns the history. I hope the spirits of that family have found peace now that their remains have been returned to their relatives. As for me, I will never hunt in those mountains again. The legacy my grandfather left me was not a cabin or 40 acres of land. It was the knowledge that evil exists, that good people can do terrible things through inaction, and that some places hold on to their darkness no matter how much time passes. The Appalachian Mountains are beautiful, but they are also unforgiving. They remember what happens in their hollows and ridges. And sometimes, when the living refuse to speak the truth, the dead find their own ways to be heard.